Number one, thank you for being here. I wanted to just start with some introductions. My name is John Eiler, and I've been working in education for 20 plus years right now. I've lost track. Since 2010, I've been working as a technical assistance facilitator for California, working specifically with districts who have been identified as significantly disproportionate. And prior to that, my background is that of a middle school, high school teacher. I was a leader at a district office and then a regional leader in California. We have SELPAs. So I was a SELPA administrator and then started doing this consulting work in 2010. Eddie, I'm excited to have Eddie join me. He's a good friend and colleague in this space. And Eddie, I'd like for you to just go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. I don't know what to say. Good evening, good afternoon. It should be good afternoon. At least I'm on the East Coast, so I'm like, sun has gone down here on this side. So it's good to see everyone. Thank you for joining this conversation around a very sort of unique sort of dynamic that happens within the context of exploring disparities. I'm Eddie Fergus. I'm faculty at Rutgers University Newark campus in the urban education department. I'm an applied researcher that focuses on the nature to which we're seeing disparities exists in three particular areas of practice that I've been focused in on, which is discipline, special ed, and gifted AP and honors. I've similar to John, I've been doing this work for quite a long time, and and seen it's and worked with a variety of institutions, whether it's at the federal level, particularly with the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights. So for those who've had those experiences around OCR, I've been one of those consultants that have been brought in to do the data analysis around the nature of the disparities. Also have done work with the Legal Defense Fund that has also been playing a pivotal role at various moments when OCR has sort of, depending on the administration, has waned in terms of their prioritization around these issues of discrimination. And also been on the side of working with school districts that have been having to address issues of an OCR complaint, and been named as a consultant to help school districts remedy these set of issues. So I look forward to having this dialogue around sort of what are we learning from these sort of OCR patterns across the country.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie. I want to give a little bit of context around why this webinar, why now. This past summer, fall, I wanted to put together something that was specifically looked at patterns that we were seeing in the state of California across OCR resolutions, and also some settlements that both Eddie and I have been involved in to some extent. And part of the reason for that is we, from a significant disproportionality perspective, we currently don't have any districts in California, at least, that have been identified as significantly disproportionate in the area of discipline. And I think, like other states, there are multiple years of data that are used to make those determinations. And so going into the 24-25 school year, I think we're going to be seeing a different landscape in terms of districts that are identified significantly disproportionate because of discipline and removals. And so I think this is timely to be able to get in front of that, not just from a SIGDIS perspective, but also some patterns that we're seeing with regard to these resolutions, settlements. With that, know that this isn't intended to be anything that we're doing in terms of giving legal advice. This is simply just sharing our experiences and our practices with districts in this space. All right, let's move into this. Eddie.
This is where I got to remind myself, I unmute. So the dynamic we have to contextualize around this work is, I'm always very mindful of historicizing sort of the role that OCR has played, right? Recognizing that the statute that surrounds OCR, which comes out of the Civil Rights Act, legislates the need for an office to be able to administer the various types of laws that are prohibiting discrimination. And it really came out of all of the great work that needed to happen in the 1960s. And so the purpose of OCR is to ensure that they are following up on areas of or complaints of discrimination that community members have put forth regarding what's happening within our school systems, recognizing, right, that it is the journey that school districts are taking in needing to desegregate. And some of us may not use that language as part of our lexicon in terms of describing what we're doing. But that's intensely what we are continuing to do. We are still needing to do habits of trying to desegregate our systems because we are seeing the disparate outcomes that are happening in terms of who's ending up in special ed, who's ending up being disciplined. And it's not just by race, ethnicity, it's also by language, it's also by student disability status, it's also in terms of sexuality. And the need for having an office that really helps to identify that this is a reoccurring issue and having to support school districts in terms of addressing it has been critical to our development as not only sort of the school systems, but also as educators and needing to understand that the journey of trying to desegregate a system has not been easy and continues to be a priority for the work that we do. So part of what John's going to talk about, sort of contextualizing sort of how did we get here, right? In particular, him and I, in terms of the work that we've gotten to do.
Yeah. Thanks, Eddie. I wanted to start with just about 10 years ago, just an example of this was a lawsuit and resulting settlement that both Eddie and I were involved with the Kern High School District, and we'll just refer to this as the Sanders settlement or the Sanders case. Just a little bit about kind of Kern High School District. 2004, fall of 2004, there was a lawsuit that was brought against the Kern High School District. Kern High is one of the largest high school only districts, not only in California, but in the nation. They serve about 42,000 high school kids across 19 comprehensive campuses and 5 alternatives. It's like a city of adolescents. And there was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of several individual students and also some organizations. Actually, let me put this up here. Dolores Huerta Foundation was one of them, Faith in Action, and then 16 individuals. There were 5 different law firms that were representing these plaintiffs and 13 attorneys. On the defense side, the district had worked with Lozano Smith, 2 attorneys, and then they also had an in-house counsel who supported that. And right as that was happening, I was asked to be the technical assistance facilitator for significant disproportionality as part of California's Technical Assistance Center. And so these 2 pieces were colliding at the same time. And so as we did our root cause analysis, what you're seeing here are some excerpts from some articles that were written following a board presentation that basically highlighted, hey, district hires this expert to come in and help them through their significant disproportionality. And what do you know? The findings are exactly what we filed the lawsuit for. So it started with just this fire, if you will, around these claims and also the disproportionality. So here's some of the details. There was a settlement that occurred about 2.5 years later, and 2017. We'll be sharing some of that with you. But this is really the one situation where Eddie and I really started to work together. You'll see as part of this, there's an expert team that was defined. The district named Eddie and I, and the defensive counsel, plaintiff counsel named 2 other folks that I'll share with you in just a minute. But Eddie and I spent hours and hours and hours in mediation trying to find the right language and come to a settlement for this particular case. Here's some pictures. Dolores Huerta Foundation was involved. Dolores Huerta herself was very involved in this. You'll see that there was a lot of experts and attorneys involved. Down at the bottom, you'll see this is a picture from their community forum. There was a lot of publicity 2 times a year. We came together to report out to the community in terms of progress and outcomes for students. And you can see kind of the nature. There was marches that would occur from a particular location down to the district office or wherever the community forum was held. So a lot of energy around this particular settlement and some progress, quick progress and continuing progress. And so we're going to share a little bit of what that district put into place, but also from a general OCR perspective, what we're seeing. What were the issues in that particular case? Policies and procedures, discipline guidelines. There was a lot of inconsistency. This was one of the big pieces that the consistency across school sites was very different in terms of how we were responding to students. There was a big emphasis on alternative placements, particularly the voluntary placements. So it was basically the claim that students were being counseled into the suspended expulsion, and it was a waiver of rights. And so therefore they were placed in an alternative setting in lieu of kind of a threat of a larger, more significant disciplinary action. There was also some claims around just the facilities, alternative education facilities, and equity, professional learning, the need for professional learning, both implicit bias, equity, and mindsets around that. PBIS, social emotional learning, were some of the areas that were represented in not only the allegations, but also the resolutions. The accountability piece, there is an expert team which engaged in a cycle of inquiry. We would meet quarterly. There were 4 of us. Eddie and I were on that team. There were 4 of us that would meet quarterly to look at not only outcome data, but also fidelity data, and then community engagement, transparency. This is the 2 times a year, the community forums. These were the costs that were publicized. This is what you will find in newspaper articles, but I would say that this is grossly underestimated in terms of the overall cost that the district has spent on this issue. Here's the team of efforts. Many of you are probably very familiar with Jeff Sprague. Rachel Godsill was new to us and new to this team. She is out of the Perception Institute, I think attorney by training, and runs the Perception Institute. I know, Eddie, you've done some work with her since that time, but they've done some really good work around mind sciences and leveraging that to address racial injustice and racial disparities, not only in education, but in a variety of systems. All right, I'm going to start with this piece before we get into the data on the OCR. You'll see that there's a lot of emphasis on systems, and I like to start with the way that we would design our systems determines the ways in which people are included and excluded, the places they belong and don't belong. And the reason I start with this is because when we look at disparity data, it is the result of systems which reflect a belief system and perpetuates a belief system. And so what you'll see a lot in terms of the resolutions that are coming from these OCR resolutions, that actually the corrective actions that are coming from this, is there's a lot of system change. And so I want to kind of put that in the forefront. So what is the sample? You can go on to, you just Google Office of Civil Rights resolutions, and you'll come to a page that looks like this. It's public information. And so this is really where I started, and I was really interested in just looking at OCR resolutions that were specific to the area of discipline. And some of those might reside in, institutes of higher education. I narrowed that down to just look at elementary and secondary education OCR cases. So here's kind of the filter, the sample set of the data that we're going to be showing you and kind of talking through in just a minute. California, Texas, and North Carolina won the top 1 and 2 seats, if you will. Texas and North Carolina tied, if you will, for the second highest number of OCR cases. California carried the largest of any of the states at 26. The filter: type of institution, elementary, secondary, just type of discrimination, discipline only. And then I looked at resolve dates that were within kind of a tight range, so just 2016 to 2023. And at that time, between 2011 and 2023, there were 141 cases. I think right now, if you go on there, you'll find that there are 142 cases. Roughly 20% of those were representative of California, and then 10% North Carolina and Texas. 39 states overall were represented in this particular category. The sample that I used to do was 10 of the most recent cases that were coming out of California, 3 of the most recent cases that were coming out of Texas, 4 that were coming out of North Carolina, and then the 2 recent lawsuits from California, one being the Sanders case that I mentioned previously, and the other is a fairly new settlement, and that's coming out of Sacramento City Unified with the Black Parallel School Board. Finally reached the settlement with Sacramento City. So these will be some learnings from not only these cases that you see in front of you, but also some of those 2 lawsuits. Here's kind of the breakdown of what this looks like across the years. So for California, you'll see when those resolutions actually occurred. And then the total down at the bottom, it's not going to line up if you go vertically and add those up. The total is just the total number of OCR resolutions in general. The lighter blue are the ones that were included in the sample. And Eddie, I think when you first saw this, you kind of made the comment like the resolutions don't necessarily tie to, a political element in terms of where our government was in terms of OCR involvement. I think you've all experienced that depending on the administration, that the involvement of OCR fluctuates and changes. And so the resolutions that you see, for example, in 15, 16, 17, and when you look at these cases, the allegations when this actually occurred were oftentimes 2, 3, even 4 years prior to that. And so sometimes it takes quite a while for these to actually reach resolution status. Eddie, did you have any other thoughts on that? Just the
No, the one thing I wanted folks to know as we think about the resolutions, and John highlighted this, is that it could take several years, obviously, for these resolutions to arrive to their point of departure. And so though it may look as if like during the years of 2014 to 2019, like there's a large sort of numbers of resolutions, those are probably reflective of resolutions that actually activities that started years before. Because especially during, I know between the 2016 and 2020 timeframe, the nature to which OCR complaints greatly diminished in terms of, I shouldn't say complaints, the complaints were there, but just as a matter of the degree to which OCR was active in pursuing these particular sets of complaints that were arriving due to a variety of mandates that actually were occurring during that time frame that generated sort of whether or not action was being taken forward. So these resolutions are probably reflective of prioritization that was done in the prior administration, federal administration at that time.
So let's take a look at some of the quantitative. These are just by the numbers, if you will, and then we'll move into a qualitative space where we can add some of our kind of thoughts and experiences and give you kind of a deeper level, if you will. So areas of analysis, what did I look at? I look at disaggregating this by statute. Level is something I came up with because I didn't really know what other bucket to put it into, but some of these allegations or complaints were specific to an individual. Some were specific to a systemic or a system issue, and then there was one that was very situational. And so I kind of put them into those categories so you can see where the breakdown was. We'll take a look at what were the allegations, and then what was the percentage, if you will, the composition of those allegations across the sample. The resolution outcome, which is basically how is this resolved? Not all of these cases, in fact, more than half of them resolved from a voluntary resolution, as opposed to OCR concluding their investigation and coming up with a list of findings and corrective actions. And so that'll be interesting. There's some interesting takeaways, I think, from that to consider. And then we'll take a look at corrective actions. What were the corrective actions that were listed in here, and also the composition, the weight of those. So from a statute perspective, this is what we're looking at. These aren't going to necessarily line up. Like if you add 50 and 61%, obviously it's over 100%. And so what this is saying is that 50% of the complaints, if you will, in the sample size had to do with race and national origin, and 61% had to do with disability. What that means is some of these complaints had to do with both race and disability at the same time. Some of them were just disability only. Some of them were just race, national origin only, ethnicity. There was one that was a little bit interesting. They had identified socioeconomic status as one of the complaints that they had in there, but that was a unique situation. If we unpack just the race and national origin, 11% of the complaints were dealing specifically with students who are Native American, 22% involved students who are Latino, and 78% involved students who are Black. The level, 56% of these complaints had to do with a system issue, meaning the system is responding more harshly with discipline to Black students than they are to white students, for example. 61% were individual. So it was failed to, implement a 504 plan, or failed to conduct manifestation determination for a student after 10 days. And it was a change in placement, something along those lines. Many of them involve both a system and an individual component. And then, as I mentioned before, one of them was situational. Let's take a look at some of the allegations. What were the allegations that were represented? So these are all of them, and then I'll show you kind of the breakdown, if you will, with regard to composition. Discrimination concerning assignment of schools. This, I believe, was a North Carolina one, and it had to do with policies, and this was board policies around who got to attend what particular school. And it was eventually corrected because the board had changed their policies before OCR had made a determination of findings, but that was a unique case just to that one particular complaint. Discrimination concerning extracurricular activities and graduation ceremonies, that was the same the same LEA that had that. Students were not allowed to participate in graduation ceremonies and extracurricular activities. It was sports specifically. There's discrimination concerning meaningful participation, and that specified parents, and it had to do with language, and that there was a lack of access for this particular parent to participate meaningfully in the child's education because of language, and not being able to access content and problem solving. Discrimination concerning unexcused absences and or truancies. This one was a little bit different in that what they were claiming was that the school system was responding differently to white students who had put in absences and truancies versus Black students. And so more of the white absences and truancies were excused, and the Black absences and truancies were unexcused. Exclusionary practices, these are removals, out of school suspensions, or even in school suspensions into like a kind of on-campus suspension type of a room. Failure to adequately address harassment. This one surprised me. This was a of complaints that had this in there, that we basically turned a blind eye to harassment that was happening. On the right-hand side, you'll see a lot more of the individual pieces: failure to evaluate 504, for 504 special education eligibility, failure to implement, failure to provide services after 20 days removal, failure to do a manifestation determination review, frequent or more severe punishment by race and or student with disability. That was more of a system piece as opposed to an individual. Placement changes, and this would be students who were maybe moved from one comprehensive campus to another because of discipline, or moved into an alternative setting because of discipline. And then there were also some claims of retaliation against students and parents for them bringing these claims in the first place. And I'll give this just a minute for you to take a look at, but here's kind of the breakdown. So what we would do in looking at this: retaliation on a student or parent, 11% of the sample had that as one of the allegations. Placement changes, a third had listed placement change as an allegation. 78% more frequent or severe punishment by race or student with disability. The data on this was interesting. The OCR does a pretty extensive data dive around how we're responding to students for the same type of behavior, and disaggregating that by race and ethnicity. I'm just going to highlight some of these other ones. The individual pieces, you'll see failure to implement or failure to assess. And then this one was surprising to me, and almost a quarter, the failure to adequately address harassment came up. Eddie, anything stand out here for you?
I think what we're, what's going to be important for us to kind of pay attention to, and I think what most folks are always curious about, is what's the nature to which some of these allegations are individual based versus a system. There is a dimension where there is, it's tough to know what's the fine line in terms of understanding that this is an individual action or a nature to which a system's given permission for an individual action to occur, right? So the degree to which, there may have been a discriminatory sort of response in regards to punishment around suspension that may have been distinctly different for one racial, ethnic, or linguistic group than another, right? But the degree to which it's also that individual making that decision is also in an environment that gives permission for that type of distinction to actually happen, right? So it's that fine line of knowing, is it an individual who causes, or is it the way in which our code of conduct is organized that gives so much latitude that the degree of bias that individuals may have can seep right into and allow for sort of those types of distinctions to happen. And I think that's what we see in a lot of these allegations, is that there is a tension point in terms of understanding whether it's at the individual level or systemic level. And that is at the core of sort of the history around the OCR office existing.
All right, if we dig into just the individual allegations, this is a breakdown of where those fell. Placement changes, more frequent severe punishment, failure to implement, failure to assess or evaluate. Let's get into some of the resolution data. I thought this was interesting. 50% of these complaints were resolved voluntarily, and 18% insufficient, 2% were dismissed. That was very infrequent. And then 30%, there was sufficient evidence for OCR to make a determination. And I think what was interesting for me about this is in reading through these, I think these OCR complaints and the reports on them, the resolutions were anywhere from like 2 pages to 50 pages. And when you read through, even the ones that had voluntarily reached a resolution, there's still an analysis. Here's, the legal, limit, if you will, in terms of here's our standard, here's our analysis, and then here's our finding. That's consistent in all of them, regardless of whether there's sufficient evidence is found or voluntary resolution. So for these districts, all of this data was publicly available in these reports, regardless of whether there's a finding of sufficient evidence or voluntary resolution. And so I think just knowing that from an LEA perspective, getting in front of this and doing your own investigative work and being willing to jump into this ahead of time, I think you can resolve a lot of these cases a lot quicker. I found it interesting that 50% of them were voluntarily resolved. Corrective actions. What were the corrective actions? Here's a list of what came up. Communication with MOU or law enforcement. Some of this was revision of an MOU, and some of this was communication. So it said you need to write a letter explaining this to whoever you're contracting with for your SRO services. And other situations, it was a revision of the actual MOU. Communication with district personnel, that was pretty common. You'll send out a memo explaining or clarifying this particular policy. Compensatory services were very specific to the individual students. Comprehensive evaluation for 504 IEP, that's, I think, pretty standard. If there wasn't an evaluation that was done, then a corrective action is to do the evaluation. The next 3, data analysis, collection, and reporting. You'll see we have a slide on this in a little bit in terms of some things to consider in terms of data collection and analysis. But that was consistent in most of the system findings, if you will, or corrective actions involve systemic discipline issues. Development of discipline guidelines is very common. Establishing an equity committee is something that we're seeing more and more of. I'd say the more recent OCR resolutions involve the establishment of a committee and an expert or an expert team in some cases. Individual remedy to students, you find that in not just the compensatory services, but in the settlements, like the Sanders case. You'll see that there's individual remedy that was specified in a dollar amount for students that were named as plaintiffs. There's reference to the establishment of a tiered system of support. Publicizing discipline data, this was very common. So outcome data, that they want to make that very public. So very similar to the current high school district where they did the community forums twice a year. They want to have some type of structure where data are either posted on a website or there's some type of a forum for people to engage with the data and ask questions. In many of these resolutions, there is a call to do a root cause analysis and develop a corrective action plan. In cases where they found that the district acted in a way that was more harshly to one racial ethnic group than the other or individual students, there was a corrective action to go back and remove that suspension and then redact student records. Retention of an external expert or experts. One that I found interesting was the next one, the retention of a positive school climate director, or someone who holds that role. They basically are saying, we want someone within the district office who is responsible for kind of monitoring positive school climate. Eddie has some recommendations too in terms of climate surveys coming up here in just a couple of minutes. Revision of board policy and administrative regulations. It's not just, hey, your board needs to consider this, but thou shalt revise this particular board policy or AR. Revision of policy practices, regulations. That could have been discipline guidelines. It could have been MTSS guidelines or guidebooks, could be SST or 504 procedures. There are a variety of policies that they named in there. School climate surveys was very common in systemic allegations of discrimination. And then student parent information sessions. Training was in there. Training is, I think, probably it was evident in almost all of the resolutions, nearly all of them. And when they say training, it's not just, offer 3 trainings. It's every single person in the district shall be trained in these areas. And I think looking at our experience, Eddie, with Kern High, that's 3,000 or 4,000 people that you're training, 1, 2, 3 days. It's very time intensive and extremely costly to do that. So here's where I'm going to let this sit for a minute, and then Eddie, jump in with some of your thoughts here. But this is where those corrective actions fell in terms of composition. So 83% had training identified as a corrective action. And know that most of these actually had multiple corrective actions. And so they might have data analysis, reporting, and collection identified and training identified at the same time.
So while we're gonna pause in a little bit so we can answer some of the questions that are in the chat. One of the points that I think we have to consider around these corrective actions, and having worked with a handful of school districts on the corrective action side, is finding the right tension points between what are the things that are about making systemic changes that are permanent versus those that are temporary, right? And I think and some of these things can exist in each of these corrective actions. So for example, around training. So you can have, as part of what's transpired in some districts, where they do trainings where everybody's getting training around implicit bias, right? Where that is a momentary sort of reaction, where it's a sort of, particularly these implicit bias, provides awareness, right? But the degree to which it becomes a permanent nature of training is the degree to which it gets to be applied within the context of how we are operating as a PBIS team, how we are operating as part of an MTSS team, right? So the training could be a launch pad, but to make it a more permanent feature, right, to sustain the manner in which it is not a reaction to, but rather a preventative work ongoing. This is part of the support that we've gotten to do with districts, is to hold steady. How is it that this training, this new pedagogical sort of system of operating, becomes a permanent element of how all of the systems actually operate?
Eddie, I'm just going through the chat. We have a couple questions in there, and I think one just hit the Q&A that I haven't looked at yet. Mildred, I'm just going to start with yours. Have you returned to look at data for Kern? Are students benefiting from the interventions? Yes, looking at data for Kern is an ongoing piece. They have right now, they're looking more specifically at their OCI, on-campus intervention, which is truly restorative and instructional in nature, and they're looking at their repeat rates for students who end up back in the office for the same types of behaviors. So that's really more of an indicator for them, and those are really low. It's less than 10% of students that they find back in OCI for the same offense. They've also expanded a little bit of this because they're looking at inequities in other areas of their system. So they have an equity director right now, and a team of people who are working on looking at equity with regard to advanced placement courses, with regard to grading policies and practices. And so Eddie did a lot of work with them in the very beginning along those kind of pathways. And so they made some significant changes to removing, SDC and RSP classes, if you will, making available, taking away the red line around access to advanced placement courses, revising grading practices. So yeah, there's been a lot of system changes, but I would say it's a continual challenge. It's something that is continually at the forefront. And I think we're seeing there are some schools that are doing better than others in terms of their disparity within their discipline practices. But yes, they are continuing to look at data. Let's see if there's another question in here. let's see, is there a breakdown of resolutions related to where the school's districts are, rural, urban, economic levels? No, I did not do that, but that would be interesting to take a look at that. I'm just going through in my mind kind of where the California ones that I'm aware of. There were some that were very rural, Northern California, but I would say a lot of those, I think Eddie, you and I had to have had some experience with, I think, 9 of the districts in that sample, and they're probably larger, mid-sized to larger districts.
And I think there's a dynamic that and a colleague did this analysis, oh my God, many years ago, where they were looking at districts that were being cited for disproportionality in special ed and suspensions. And I use that example to answer this question, where there was a good portion of them that were suburban school districts that are considered what are called first ring school districts, right? Those that meaning the school districts that are right outside large urban cities and are and have had a change in demographics in from one decennial census to another that has been markedly that is also parallel pattern that's happening. I'm not saying there's a relationship. I'm just saying there's a parallel pattern that we have seen in the research around disproportionality, district cited for disproportionality in special ed and suspension.
All right. Well, let's move on into some of these other ones. And then Ed, if you see some other questions in there, let's bring those up. So qualitative, these are just general observations, and we're just kind of add our own experiences and thoughts, ideas to some of these elements. When you start to read through multiple resolution agreements, you'll see that there's definitely a structure and a template and a process to that. And so regardless of whether, and I think I mentioned this earlier, whether it's resolved by a finding that there was sufficient evidence or a voluntary resolution, all of that is documented in the resolution itself. And so there's the allegation, the legal standard for that, the facts surrounding the case, and OCR does a significant amount of fact finding with interviews and focus groups and digging through data. And all of that is displayed in that report. So just wanted to kind of bring that to the forefront and make sure that we were kind of aware of that. I also noticed, and this is kind of interesting, Eddie, I'm not sure what your take is on this, but even within the OCR reports, there's a lot of language like criminalizing type of, you see violations, you see offenses, you see FTO, first time offender type of language in there. And I just found that as something that was interesting to see in OCR resolutions. And then the last thing I put on here was the reporting and accountability around this was pretty extensive. It wasn't just, all right, here's a resolution, let's put a nice little bow on it and go and do it. It was, no, these data are due to OCR, every 3 months. And it was pretty substantial. All right, some of the allegations. Let me move this around so I can see here. System discrimination typically involved access, exclusion, discipline practices. There's a lot about frequency and severity. So students who were either Latino or Black students being sent to the office more frequently was a common pattern or trend, and or when they were there, their response to behavior, the discipline piece was a lot more severe. Harassment, retaliation, I think I mentioned this before, it was either the neglect, not addressing it at all, or just this, very passive, permissive way of dealing with it. Like, yes, we acknowledge it. We talked to them, we said something about it, but it continues to persist. It wasn't really anything that was substantive in terms of changing that harassment. A lot of the cases involving discipline involve subjective categories. That was very clear. So when you look at the fact-finding piece that OCR does, continues to substantiate what we see kind of across the nation, that discipline is very subjective when it comes to disparities that you find in discipline. So some of the areas, defiance, insubordination, and profanity were some of the big ones that came up. Discipline allegations addressing severity focused on out-of-school suspension and placements in alternative learning programs. And so this was a big piece that had to do with changes of placement, failure to either evaluate for a 504 or do a manifestation determination. A lot of these were kind of triggered by movements from one comprehensive campus to another. And in some cases that was claimed as a retaliatory move. And some were a movement from a comprehensive campus onto an alternative learning campus somewhere else. And it didn't matter if it was involuntary or voluntary. It was the decision to move. And then I just mentioned placement changes was a big area. I think I mentioned this before. I don't have to hit that again. Large amounts of data went into this file, reviews, interviews with people, a lot of output, if you will, pulling data out of the student information system and analyzing that. Most allegations were settled, if you will, by voluntary resolution, over 50%. All right, let's take a look at some corrective actions. What were the training areas? I can say from the Kern specifically, a lot of the training says you'll train on this new policy, or you'll have to train people on, 504 practices once you revise them. So that's very common. I would say the Kern was probably one of the more comprehensive training pieces I've seen in the resolution. There were a variety of areas. Social emotional learning, I think there was a 2-day piece there. There was an implicit bias training that everyone needed to go through. There was a PBIS training that people needed to go through. Restorative practices that everyone needed to go through. It was pretty significant. Eddie, help me out if I'm missing any as part of that system, but those are some common areas. Revision of discipline guidelines. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think what's key around this is the ways in which the trainings were organized by the staffing levels, meaning like what are the types of staff who were seen as prime stakeholders to have that content, right? And I think there was if I remember correctly, there was an organizing of that, right? But there were also moments, I think there were some trainings where it was raised to the level of like, okay, so what does it mean for this, this type of staff to have this? So for example, if you have staff who are doing enrollment, right, or registration, what does it mean for them to have implicit bias training? Like, so where do they get to apply it within the context of their role?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, they had by position, they had this position needs these trainings, this position needs these trainings. It was pretty comprehensive. Let's hit on some data practices. I mentioned that the collection of data, the analysis of data, the reporting of data was a big theme across the board. They would actually list out in the corrective action, these are the pieces of data that you need to be collecting in your student information system and reporting back to us on, meaning OCR, on a frequent basis. So definitions of offenses, making sure that those were well-defined and less subjective across the board. Logging in school suspension or soft suspensions, as they refer to that. So it's, we call the parents and we ask them to come pick up the child early from school. It's not really logged as a suspension. It's, the parent checked the child out of school. Or removal from one class to another. It's not really logged as a period suspension or an in-school suspension. It's just, student is spending time in another person's classroom. Reporting all referrals, they found that there was oftentimes missing incidents or referrals. FTO is first-time offender data, so they're looking at disaggregating by what is the response to students the first time that they show up in the office with this behavior versus the second time and the third time, and how does that vary across race and ethnicity and also by disability. You'll see disaggregating data by race ethnicity is kind of a must. I would say a big piece of the Sanders case was using a risk ratio as an indicator. I'd say with smaller districts, that might be a more challenging piece to do, but having some type of a early warning system that looks at disparity within not only your office referrals. I would say your low level discipline is probably a better indicator of that. Law enforcement, SRO contracts, and they're looking at contacts. How frequently were SROs in contact or involved with students, and for what reason? And I think the narrative around this, when you read into some of these resolutions, that law enforcement was involved in situations that was more discipline and control oriented than it was, enforcing the law. And so what they were saying is, they're stepping outside of their boundaries in terms of law enforcement and why they're there on a campus, and they're becoming involved in discipline and using kind of their positionality in a way that is disparate across racial, ethnic lines, and also disability. Eddie, you had, I know, some comments around school climate surveys you wanted to talk about.
And it's one of the unique features that we're seeing in a lot of school districts is taking on sort of measuring sort of climates, doing climate surveys. And I know in California in particular, there's a list of sort of climate surveys that are made available. And one of the cautionary pieces that I'm always recommending to school districts is to make sure that these climate measures, there's always a great deal of commonality in terms of what they're measuring. But in particular, when we're talking about the nature to which we are supporting improving environments that are socially and culturally responsive to populations that have been normalized to be seen as in the margins, but then treated as in the margins, requires us to have different types of school climate measures that actually measure the dynamics of, if we're having staff that are being trained around implicit bias, what's the nature to, we're also asking youth in schools, are they experiencing differences in cultural perspective taking, that there's a greater frequency to which staff are operating with being able to ask questions and humanizing sort of who kids are, or having survey measures that are asking youth questions regarding the degree to which they're experiencing cultural safety, and not just, because I know we do a lot of physical safety, right? Do you feel a sense of threat on the way to school, in the classroom, in the hallways? But the nature of cultural safety, meaning are kids sort of finding that they can represent who they are, whatever that may be, in whatever spaces that exist in schools. And then finally, school climate measures that pay attention to kids having opportunities to demonstrate pride in their own identities, right? And being able to hear from youth over time whether or not they're finding that conversations around their own, whether it's racial, ethnic, linguistic, or sexuality pride, is not only allowed, but also the ways in which adults step in to correct when there are microaggressions that occur within the context of schools. So having measures within school climates that lend themselves to kind of capture those dynamics as well.
Thanks, Eddie. We've got just a couple minutes here. I wanted to go back to the Q&A. Kim says this is very helpful helpful information for CCEIS planning as well as continuous improvement planning. Thank you for that. I'm glad you're finding it useful and helpful. Roger asked the question, who is the culprit in most cases? Teachers who aren't knowledgeable or not willing to follow through on IEP objectives and guidelines, or administration not being supportive? I would say, based on just the sample and the resolutions that I read, it's very much administration. And so decisions that were made administratively and how to respond. Let me skip to this last piece here. I wanted to show one other example. Restorative discipline guidelines or responsive discipline guidelines was a big area. I just want to give you a model or sample for that. And then we have a little treat for you. Eddie has released the new book, and so we want to kind of point you to that and give a plug and a discount code for that as we wrap up here. One of the big recommendations, or not recommendations, but corrective actions that you'll see in systemic issues of disparity, discrimination around discipline, is the development of discipline guidelines. And I would say, from a conceptual perspective, this is a good model to look at that provides kind of a tight in terms of the way that we respond to student misbehavior, but also loose in terms of being able to give kids what is needed. And so this is an example where you have behaviors listed on the left-hand side, leveled responses. A level 1 response is a low level response. Level 5 is obviously much more intensive. And so it says for each of these behaviors, tardiness, cutting class, excessive absences, those behaviors should elicit a level 1 or level 2. Over on the right-hand side, you see, okay, so what are those responses? And they're typically falling into 2 buckets, both reduction-oriented or what we might call consequence types of responses. And then there are also interventions or increase, meaning we're teaching a skill or we're repairing harm, that type of a response. So every behavior should have some type of a guide, if you will, in terms of this is the type of response that we should use in responding to student behavior. So this is very helpful. This was one of the strategies that Kern High used. They recently just did an analysis of how closely are our responses to behavior aligning with our guide? And then is that actually resulting in or translating to reduction of behaviors? And so it led them to do some additional training around that. So I want to leave us with this. We've got just a couple minutes here for any more Q&As, but I definitely wanted to give us time to take a look at this. Eddie has released a new book. In fact, it's not even, you can pre-order it now on Amazon, but you can order it directly from Corwin. And if you do that, there's a discount of 20% if you use Save 20 on there. So Eddie, I wanted to give you some time to kind of give us a little plug and a taste of what this is about.
Thank you. And I really appreciate everyone kind of coming because, part of what I think we and John and I have been connecting around this, I think John and I, we've been doing this work together for like 15 years now. And part of what we've always recognized is that we're so mired into really addressing what's happening within the system, right? And what about the system gives permission and allowances for it to operate in a way that constructs sort of these habits of whether it's intentional or unintentional discrimination that is predicated on bias. So much of my research work has really centered around the system itself in terms particularly desegregating the system. But the query that I've always gotten from educators is, well, what about how the individual is desegregating themselves, right? And so I really been taking this on for many years in terms of trying to understand what does it mean for the individual to actually do their own desegregation, because we recognize that though we've had a policy approach to try to address the nature of systemic discrimination that has resulted in sort of habits of desegregation, not just in sort of school-wide, but also within programming like special ed and discipline and GATE and so forth, we haven't had a national curriculum for figuring out how do we desegregate ourselves of the nature of how as a society, we carry levels of biases. And I think we're currently seeing an ongoing habit of a social cultural divide that is predicated on sort of this challenge that we have of knowing what does it mean to it's not about getting along, but it's a matter of sort of humanizing each other. Right. And so there's a nature of sort of individualized work that we have to do. And this book is actually, it's written from the vantage point of supporting the individual educator to do the work alongside and within trying to desegregate a system. So that's the driving sort of intent of this book. And I look forward to folks engaging in it, and look out for, I'm going to be doing some book clubs next year. Because I really want to learn from people in terms of how they're digesting sort of this, their own commitment to this national curriculum to learn how to humanize each other with a very different cross-cultural lens.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie. I think we're just about at time. Eddie, I want to say thank you for doing this. This is the first time we've done this webinar together.
Yeah.
New territory, new content for us to navigate together. This will also be, I'll be presenting this at the Northwest PBIS conference next week. If you're in that part of the country and attending that, please stop in and say hi. But thank you for being part of this and spending your afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the country, with us. Our plan is to be able to post this. I believe we're going to package this up and put a link to the recording and materials to send out to the participant group. And I believe it'll also be hanging on our website. We also have, I think, a 5-part webinar series that will be launching in 24-25, addressing various aspects of not only disproportionality, but also mental health and behavior in education. So we hope to see you on those as well. Good to see all of you. Familiar names. I can't see faces, but thank you for being here and supporting us. We've enjoyed the time with you.
It's great. Enjoy the day, folks.